Alrighty, history fans, welcome to the second lecture in our look at cultural trends in the early 19th century. In our first such lecture, we examined philosophy, art, literature, what you may describe as high culture. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to popular culture, and we'll talk about how in the early 19th century, in this period of transcendentalism, the literary figures we talked about in our previous lecture, in this period of the early 1800s when those trends in high culture are developing, you have at the same time, arguably, the very beginning of what we can describe as a mass or popular culture. So in the second lecture, we're turning our attention to the culture that is consumed by a large swath of the population, mass culture, pop culture, and here we'll describe how such a mass culture develops in this period right alongside those trends we saw in our previous lecture in high culture. Why does a popular culture develop for the first time in American history in the early 19th century? Well, it's related to the trends that we have been examining in this period in many previous lectures. Trends like industrialization, urbanization. With urbanization, you now had an agglomeration of people in the same social space, people living in cities. And that meant there was a marketplace for goods and also images, representations, cultural expressions. With cities came a captive marketplace. You had now a large body of people living in a concentrated space, and as we'll see here, that created a marketplace for pop culture, for consumable forms of expression that develop in this period. It also meant that forms of expression, representations, could simultaneously influence a mass audience, that mass market. So with urbanization came a clustering of people together in the same social space. With it came a marketplace for popular culture. And that's why popular culture develops for the first time in this period. And it meant that a lot of the images, ideas that are sold and circulating through that market can reach many people and create for the first time a mass experience that we would associate with popular culture. Popular culture, by definition, is forms of culture consumed by a large swath of the population. Well, urbanization facilitated that. With industrialization now, there's a separation between home and work. You leave your house to go work in a factory, and that brought you into that public realm. And we'll talk about how with people in this public space, going to their jobs, leaving their homes out in the public, there were opportunities to engage with and consume that popular culture. It's a period where culture and society is much more open, expressive. It's an age of mass popular participation in politics, the age of universal white manhood suffrage, the age of a popular style of politics, and that too is related to the creation of a mass culture for the first time, where people are out experiencing bonfires, parades, other forms of mass expression. It's the age where Charles Finney is crisscrossing the nation and holding these tent revivals, and people are having this mass expression in terms of religiosity and the Second Great Awakening, and all this is related to the advent of a mass culture where people are participating in these events in ways that were unprecedented in a previous pre-industrial, pre-urban agricultural America. Finally, we talked in our first lecture on culture in the early 19th century about this idea of the Romantic period. This period in American and Western thought that emphasizes emotion, passions, living in the moment in many ways. We saw that in the Transcendentalists. We saw that in the paintings of the Hudson River School, which are very emotive, very much expressing emotion, a love of nature, a fear of change, a nostalgia for a simpler time. So American culture in the early 19th century is deeply influenced by this romantic movement, and so far we've seen that in high culture, in things like art and philosophy. But we'll see here, popular culture also represents a commitment to emotion, passion, and a sense of immediacy, living in the moment. Now, as a mass culture develops, in the early 19th century, right alongside that high culture we described in our previous lecture, philosophy, art, literature. Those engaged in the creation of literature, philosophy, and art tended to look down upon the culture of the masses. They were very condemnatory, finding it crass, venal, immoral in some cases. This is very common in the history of popular culture in America here from the very beginning and continuing to this day, that pop culture is often derided, subject to criticism, particularly among writers, thinkers, academics, who have a tendency to be very critical of mass culture. But it isn't just thinkers and writers and philosophers who are condemnatory. Many people, even those who consume mass and popular culture, find it crass and venal. What we're talking about here is the way in which culture in this period is contested. We talked about how Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1837 gives this lecture where he's calling for the creation of a uniquely American culture, but Emerson and many others were very critical of different forms of American expression, including mass culture. They didn't see it as indicative of an American character. For them, American culture comes from elites like them. But who speaks for America? What is the defining element of American culture? Is it the writers, the thinkers, the painters, or arguably the culture of the many, a mass culture? Who is more indicative of America? The writings of intellectuals or the forms of culture that are imbibed by the many? 100 years from now, when historians think back on 2020 life in America in the early 21st century, who is a greater barometer of the American society? Is it the novel that this year will win the Pulitzer Prize, or is it Cardi B? What's a better historical artifact? The artwork you might find in a gallery in New York, or reality TV? You can make a good argument that mass culture, popular culture, even though it's often derided and criticized because it reaches the masses, because it is so influential, therefore, is more true to an American essence or character than the writings of philosophers and painters. The point here is that when we think about American culture, there isn't one American culture. American culture, like so much of American history, is a contest and argument. And here we introduce into that field of contest what we can describe as mass culture. Certainly one key aspect of mass culture that develops in the early 19th century, newspapers. Now, newspapers prior to the 1830s were not part of mass culture. They were very limited in their reach. They were often geared towards niche audiences, people of a certain political persuasion, often people in a certain profession or economic sphere. Also, newspapers were very expensive prior to the 1830s, and that meant it was very difficult for them to reach a wide audience. They were pretty boring. You know, if you were to look at a newspaper from the 1820s, it's sort of like an almanac, a resuscitation of facts. Newspapers often imparted knowledge about weather trends, the price of certain commodities, the comings and goings of ships. They weren't very exciting. They weren't very appealing because they were, again, geared towards a limited audience. But in the 1830s, a number of trends in American society, politics, and culture served to make newspapers for the first time a mass experience, making newspapers a key part of the popular culture of this age. What are those trends? Well, the ones we've been describing now: industrialization, urbanization, changes in politics with the advent of the Jacksonian era, and all those developments played a key role in making newspapers important to the partisan politics of this age, when, again, politics became sort of personal, and there are all these kind of scandals about Certainly industrialization, urbanization created a marketplace for newspapers with people clustered in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. But another factor was the advent of the steam press, where the steam engine, which had been used to power steamboats and then spinning jennies and other machines, power looms in factories or locomotives, was now being used to power printing presses, which allowed for the mass production of newspapers in ways unprecedented prior. Early in the class, when we talked about pamphlets produced in the era of the American Revolution, pamphlets like Common Sense were produced by hand cranked printing presses where human beings, animal power, produced the newspapers. Now in the 1830s, steam engines are whirring and producing in large quantities newspapers, which meant you could create more newspapers than ever for that growing audience living in cities. There are also technological changes in terms of paper production. One of the reasons why newspapers were so expensive prior to the 1830s, paper was very expensive. It was very expensive to print on paper. But there were changes in the pulping of paper in the 1830s that made cheap paper increasingly available, and that too played a role. So you get a huge increase in the volume of newspapers being produced. In 1830, there's 65 newspapers in the country circulating at least once a week. By the end of that decade, that number had more than doubled. In 1830, there are 78,000 newspapers circulating every day, and by 1840, that number had grown as well by almost 4 times. So statistics here point to the exponential growth in newspaper circulation, and all this is a factor of what's happening between 1830 and 1840. America's urbanizing, industrializing, you have the steam press, you have changes in the production of paper, and all this leads to, again, a period where newspapers, which prior to the 1830s had been for a niche and small audience, really now become part of the mass experience in an age of mass religion, mass politics. With it comes mass culture. In the 1830s, as newspapers are now becoming part of common everyday life for New Yorkers, Bostonians, people living in the industrial cities of this age, a new economic model and a new style of journalism develops known as the penny press. The very first penny press newspapers were published in New York City, the American city in this age of urbanization, as early as 1833. They were known as penny press newspapers because they sold for, guess what, a penny. So very different than the newspaper model that predated it, where newspapers were rarely printed in small numbers, and very expensive. Now, for a penny, you could every day gain access to this form of expression and entertainment. The penny press relied on an economic model that sought to sell as many newspapers as possible. So rather than sell a few newspapers to a loyal but small audience, let's sell as many newspapers as possible. With this came greater ad revenue because you were reaching more and more people, and that meant you could charge more and more for your ads. But the penny press was more than just a way of selling newspapers cheaply. It was also a way of getting newspapers out to the masses as they are sold in public on street corners as people now leave their home and head to the factory. It's part of the open, expressive urban culture that's developing in this period. Bonfires, parades, all sorts of civic celebrations, the Holy Roller Band marching down Main Street. Well, now you had newspapers right there on the street corner. And for the scant price of a penny, you can buy a newspaper on your way to your job or your way home. Penny press also refers to a change in style in journalism. More than just an economic model, more than just a new way of getting the news to people, the penny press was a new style of journalism, and in many ways it pioneered the tabloid journalism of today. The world we have today of the National Enquirer, TMZ, clickbait articles that get you to click with the appeal to your prurient side, your interest in sex, violence, and intrigue. That contemporary America was born in the 1830s in the penny press, which pioneered a style of journalism that emphasized sex, violence, intrigue, lurid tales from the naked city. The penny press because it appealed to the masses. The penny press because it was designed to convince you to plunk down your penny and buy that newspaper. The penny press because it was a zone of competition where there were many such newspapers on street corners, had to somehow convince you to plunk down your penny for that particular newspaper. And to do so, they emphasized sex, violence, intrigue, very common newspaper stories centered on rapes and murders and abandoned children. Again, now the personal drama of strangers is part of your daily life into your mental orbit as a source of entertainment in a way that, again, predates our America of today, where you watch people on YouTube and you look at people's social media. You're brought into their intimate, personal, and performative world through the internet. Well, to some extent, you could do that in the 1830s by reading about other people's misery. These stories of your fellow New Yorkers who are suffering from these tragedies, now sold, literally, on the street corner for a penny. So it pioneered tabloid journalism. It defined a sense of what constitutes the news: misery, despair, again, lurid tales of sex, violence, and intrigue. And it also pioneered our modern conception of the reporter, someone who goes out and gets the story. That's sort of the image of a reporter, someone who's digging up the dirt, asking the questions that no one wants asked, an investigator, an interrogator. Prior to the penny press, those who wrote for newspapers were passive in their receipt of information. Again, prior to the 1830s, newspapers were short, expensive, geared towards niche, limited audiences, and really almanac-like resuscitations of information, charting, again, the comings and goings of ships or weather patterns. So you didn't have to go get the news, you just sort of took it in and then recapitulated it. But with the penny press, you had to get the best stories, the juiciest stories, the stories that, again, would convince people to plunk down their penny and buy that particular broadsheet newspaper beckoning from the street corner. So to make sure you had the juiciest, scandalous stories, the publishers of these penny press newspapers would send their reporters out to find the lurid tales from the city. And so our modern conception of a reporter, someone who goes out and gets the news, was again developed here out of the economic model of the penny press, its effort, its imperative to sell as many newspapers as possible. The emphasis was on the lurid, the sensational. Here is a smattering of headlines from penny press newspapers in New York in the 1830s, just to give you a flavor for what these newspapers were like. A mysterious disappearance. Sometimes the headlines were like that. They were deliberately vague, deliberately opaque, so that you didn't know exactly what the story was about, but it sounded intriguing. It excited your imagination, and you wanted to know more, so you plunked down your penny. A double suicide. How the hell is that even possible, right? I got to read about this. So sometimes the headlines were like that. They were deliberately enticing by being oblique and vague. But this is the United States. We love generic, obvious names. We love things that just tell you exactly what it is. So other headlines were like this one: incest by a clergyman. When you plunk down your penny for a newspaper with a headline like that, you know exactly what you're getting. So here's a good example of some headlines, and it gives you a sense of what the newspaper stories were like, how they emphasize sex, violence, intrigue, the dirty side of life, and appeal to your interest in the sensational, and also a sense of how such headlines could be alluring to Americans heading to their jobs and factories in New York City in the 1830s. Common fodder, common sources for penny press newspaper stories, train accidents. When locomotives were first used in the United States, 1830s, they were notoriously volatile, dangerous. They often exploded. They ran off the tracks. When trains first ran at night, they ran at night with no lights on them. We're talking about the 1830s. There's no electricity yet, right? So cities were dark when the sun went down. and you're roaring through that dark city, this huge train at a fairly rapid pace with no lights on. What could go wrong, right? Well, people were routinely run over, killed. Trains were fascinating, a new technology, a transformative technology, technology that allows people, goods, and ideas to circulate in ways never seen before. So people were interested in them, they wanted to see them, they wanted to learn more about them, but also that fascination came from their notoriety as so dangerous, as responsible for all sorts of accidents. So today, we might tune in to the 10 o'clock news to watch a freeway chase here in Southern California. But in the 1830s and 1840s, Americans wanted to learn more about train accidents. Many times reporters were sent to the courthouse in the effort to dig up juicy stories and follow court trials. And then they would just transcribe the testimony in trials that dealt with all sorts of human affairs and human miseries. So again, one of the things that the penny press did was it immersed you in the personal sagas and miseries of strangers. And that brings us to a key insight regarding pop culture here in this lecture that's accounting for the origins and beginnings of pop culture. Pop culture, whether it's the penny press newspapers of the 1830s or the internet culture of the 21st century, takes the distant and makes it close. That's what pop culture does. It makes you deeply invested in the lives of strangers, whether they are sports heroes, movie stars, or some jackass on YouTube opening Shopkins, right? All of a sudden you care about that person, you're immersed in their world, you bring them into your orbit. They often become part of you and your identity. I mean, think about those who are fans of certain sports franchises and they wear the t-shirt, they buy the hat. Fan is short for fanatic, right? People get tattoos based on, their favorite film franchise. There's goddamn Chewbacca on your, forearm or something, right? That shows that film franchise, that sports team, whatever it is important to you. That it's part of who you are. Even though, ultimately, it's fictional fantasy, it's the lives of strangers, movie stars who don't give a damn about you, but you are deeply invested in them. I mean, some of the examples I've just given are silly and ridiculous, although true. But in a more somber way, I mean, think about what happened in the city after Kobe Bryant and his daughter died. People who had never met Kobe Bryant, people who have no personal connection to Kobe Bryant, were weeping and crying, and there's still tributes all over the city because they were deeply invested in Kobe Bryant, the Lakers, that moment in their life where they cheered that team, maybe went and saw Kobe Bryant at the Staples Center. So pop culture has that power to really touch us in that way. And here in the penny press, you have the beginning of that, where for the first time, strangers are part of your daily cultural orbit. As in this case, you're learning about these court trials, these human miseries, where the distant is now indeed close, intimate to you. A lot of the stories in the penny press were sagas that played out over many days, many weeks, in some cases many months, certain scandals that urge you to run to the corner every day, plunk down your penny, and get the latest episode, the latest installment. There was the Maria Monk scandal, where in penny press newspapers they had a string of accounts of a Catholic nun, Maria Monk, who claimed that for some time she was held in a nunnery in Canada against her will and repeatedly raped by the Catholic priests there. Now, the Maria Monk scandal had sex, violence, intrigue, stories of a captive woman, and stories of captive women are a mainstay in American culture, going back to the colonial period, where you have captivity narratives. In the late 1600s, for the first time, a form of writing was developed in America known as the captivity narrative. This happened during King Philip's War, which doodaloo we talked about in one of our very first lectures, where Mary Rowlandson, the wife of a Puritan minister, was held captive by Native Americans during King Philip's War, and then was later ransomed so that she was free. And then she wrote about her experience, and people were fascinated by this and read it avidly on both sides of the Atlantic, and it really pioneered a form of storytelling that we still develop to this day, that Americans are still intrigued by, the story of usually a white woman held against her will. This is a story today of Natalie Holloway. It's a story of J.C. Duggard. It's a story that we've heard so many times before because it's an American tradition, and Maria Monk kind of tapped into that. So it was a story of sex, violence, a captive woman, a well-established and still to this day enduring narrative style in American culture. And the Maria Monk scandal was also very popular. It captured people's imagination, urged people to plunk down their pennies every day to get the latest episode because it fit with the anti-Catholic bias in America in the 1830s when you had the first wave of Irish immigrants to New York. As I've mentioned before in our previous lectures on industrialization, with industrialization came, for the first time, large-scale immigration to this country. And the first wave of immigrants came in the 1830s from Ireland. And it led to a huge nativist backlash. Nativism is the fear and hatred of foreigners. And sadly, tragically, that is also a long and enduring American tradition. If you've seen the Martin Scorsese film Gangs of New York, you get a little flavor of this, right? It's all about the nativism of Americans in response to this large influx of Irish immigrants that often manifest in gang violence. There's a point in that film where the lead character, Bill the Butcher, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, says, "I'm a Native American." He's not using the term in which we'd use it today, referred to an Indian, a Native American. He's saying, we were here first, and now these Irish are coming. I'm a Native American, right? Nativism. And so in New York City in the 1830s, when the Maria Monk scandal was becoming so popular and attracting a great deal of interest, there was this building anti-Catholic sentiment. And the Maria Monk scandal, because it was about Catholic priests raping a woman, Catholic priests violating, obviously, their vow of chastity, but also raping a woman, it kind of confirmed a lot of prejudices that people were developing regarding Catholics. In 1835, New York erupted in a massive fire. One of the things that really hurt the development of cities for most of the 19th century was the fact that for most of the 19th century, most buildings in American cities were made of wood. You will not see widespread use of concrete, steel, and glass until the late, very late 1800s. Through the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, most buildings were made of wood, and they were all tightly packed together, meaning that when one building broke out into a fire, the fire quickly spread. You may be a little bit familiar with the story of the Great Chicago Fire of the 1870s where, Mrs. O'Leary's cow in a barn kicked over a lantern and then the entire city burned for days and days and days. And that was in the 1870s. Again, that was towards the latter part of the 19th century, and still Chicago, like so many American cities, was a city really that was a tinderbox of sorts, ready to go up in flames. In 1835, you had a huge fire, the Great New York Fire of 1835. And this became fodder for the penny press because it's a great catastrophe. It's a unifying experience because so many New Yorkers had their lives lost and touched by that fire. So people were fascinated by it. They shared stories, and the penny press printed all kinds of stories of heroes and villains, heroes saving people, villainous landlords, jacking up the rent with housing scarcity. So like other natural disasters, tragedies, or today, pandemics, when there's a shared experience of misery, despair, it generates a lot of interest, and in this case, a lot of newspaper sales. There were even celebrity scandals in the 1830s. Well, before the celebrity culture of the 20th century, John C. Colt was the brother of Samuel Colt, the inventor, who invented, among other things, the six-shot revolver, the Colt 45, not the malt liquor, the gun. John C. Colt was his brother, and John C. Colt was accused of murdering his business associate and then hacking his body into different pieces and then mailing those body parts all over the country. So this had celebrity in it, in that Colt was the brother of a well-known inventor, Samuel Colt. It certainly had murder and violence at its heart. And then it had this sort of serial element to it, where the story just kept going on and on, because people would say, well, I found an ear in New Orleans, I found a leg in Atlanta, as all these body parts show up around the country. So well before O.J. Simpson and Lindsay Lohan and the celebrity Hulk Hogan and the celebrity scandals of today, you had the John C. Colt scandal. And then later, all of these newspaper stories that were printed on a daily basis would be cobbled together in book form and then sold in one volume, so that you could read the entire scandal from beginning to end and revisit the story. Much like today someone might binge watch an entire season on Netflix, these book form recapitulations of the story allowed you to follow the entire Maria Monk scandal from beginning to end. So you could revisit the story. You could resell and repackage the story in a way that, again, we associate with modern pop culture. Used to be people bought DVDs. You bought an entire DVD set of The Sopranos Season 3, and you could watch the whole damn thing whenever you wanted, from beginning to end. Today, you might binge watch an entire season on Netflix or some other streaming service. Well, in the 1830s, people could have a very similar experience in reading these book form encapsulations of the Maria Monk scandal, the John C. Colt scandal. Couple of images to complement this. Here on the left is the cover of one of those book form stories of the Maria Monk scandal. And here you have this illustration of this woman, angelic, looking up to God, and then you know, of course, her story of being tortured, molested by Catholic priests. Stories of woe, misery, and despair, now, again, at your fingertips. Very much the origins of a mass culture that continues to this day, just in different forms on the internet. On the right, I include here an illustration from one of the many penny press newspaper stories about the Great New York Fire of 1835. And I include it here because it's important to note these are all illustrations. You will not find photographs in American newspapers until the mid-20th century. Photography, I guess the right term is, develops in the 1830s. It's becoming invented or created. There's all kinds of different forms of early photography. There's no one guy or one person who invents photography, but the science and technology of it is developing in the 1830s. You have the very first forms of photography as early as the 1830s. It's just another form of the remarkable technological change in this period. Sewing machines, typewriters, revolvers, steamboats, railroads, and photography. But photography will remain very expensive, very rare, very dangerous through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and that's why you don't really see photography in American newspapers until the early to mid 20th century. Instead, you had illustrations. And with illustrations, you could exaggerate, amplify, because it's a drawing and not a capture of lived reality like a photograph. You could amplify, you can emphasize. And you have that here, certainly, in this illustration that really amplifies the danger, the ferocity of this fire. And also think about how such a beautiful work of art this is, and how someone walking to their factory, someone living again in desperate, impoverished conditions, as we described in our lectures on industrialization, could have such a beautiful work of art for the cost of a penny, right? If you're walking to your factory job in 1835 and you see this beckoning to you, of course you're going to plunk down your penny. So these illustrations were really artistic and beautiful, even though they often documented the tragic side of American life. Let's conclude our look at the penny press as a good example here of a very early form of pop culture developing here in the early 19th century, and one that has so influenced our pop culture now, even now in the 21st century, with a story that appeared in a penny press newspaper in New York in 1835 that one last time demonstrates so many elements of pop culture in this period, and how pop culture in any period brings the distant and makes it close. In 1835, The Sun, interesting name for the story here, a penny press newspaper in New York reported that scientists have invented a telescope that allows them to peer upon the surface of the moon, see the surface of the moon, and in doing so, answer an enduring question that likely has plagued humanity for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. What's up there? I mean, think about how human beings over tens and tens of thousands of years likely peered up upon the surface of the moon and wondered, what's up there? Well, now we can answer that. In 1835, this newspaper revealed to New Yorkers what is indeed upon the surface of the moon. What's up there? Well, I'm here to tell you there are man-bats. That's right. This article told us that when scientists peered into that telescope, they saw creatures that were half men, half bats. They found a golden temple gleaming there on the surface of the moon. They saw blue unicorns frolicking in the moon dust. And they saw biped beavers. That's right, beavers that walk on 2 feet, which I've always thought would be a great name for a rock band, right? If you have a rock band, if you're rocking out in your garage and you often turn to your bandmates and say, what should we name our band? Go with biped beavers. I mean, that will just usher in superstardom, right? So there was the story that riveted the attention of New Yorkers in 1835, telling them that on the surface of the moon, you'll find man-bats, a golden temple, blue unicorns. I mean, it reads like a breakfast cereal, right? And biped beavers. Now, I hate to break it to you, there are no blue unicorns anywhere, let alone on the surface of the moon. Obviously, we can all chuckle at this and wonder, why did people believe this, right? Well, you might be apt to giggle a bit and dismiss New Yorkers of the 1835s as dupes and fools, as so credulous. But maybe you could be a little bit more sympathetic if you think about the context of 1835. We're talking about people who are really learning to read for the first time through newspapers like this. Immigrants who are learning English for the first time, and as a result tend to be a little bit more credulous, believing of anything they read before they develop their more critical skills. But more importantly, I think, is the fact that in 1835, Americans were living in a time of concussive, remarkable, revolutionary technological change. I mean, again, I've stressed this in previous lectures. Talk about one generation of Americans who sees canals and railroads and photography and steamboats and all of these dizzying, frenetic changes. Americans in 1835 were coming to believe that what was once impossible would now be part of daily life, annihilating the limits of space and time, bridging what was unspannable. Is it too far-fetched to imagine that we now have a telescope that can peer on the surface of the moon and we can find man-bats? So one of the reasons why Americans likely were so credulous, so willing to believe, was that they lived in a fantastic period of technological change where what was once unfathomable, unbelievable, was part of daily life, as well as the way in which people were tending to, early on in their literacy, believe what they read. And then also, maybe we can be a little bit more sympathetic, less likely to dismiss and laugh at these people. Because I guarantee there's something right now in 2020 that you believe intensely, fervently, that will later turn out to be nonsense. It's just the nature of knowledge. It's the nature of science. That what was once believed to be the gospel truth later turns out to be erroneous, false, even pernicious. There once was this device in many shoe stores in the 50s and 60s, you can ask your grandparents about this, that invited you to get a perfect shoe size by putting your feet in the device and it would measure it. Well, in doing so, they were zapping you with radiation that later turned out to cause cancer, right? So there were things that people did or believed that at the time seemed sensible, good, smart, truthful, and then later turned out to be either wrong or, in some cases, pernicious. And I guarantee that our children, our grandchildren, will look back on us and say, you really believe that? You actually did that, right? So maybe we can be a little bit more sympathetic to these people in 1835 who believed there were man-bats on the moon. When later other penny press newspapers who had to compete with the Sun, who were losing readership because the Sun had this great story of man bats and biped beavers on the moon, when other rival papers published accounts that this was false, that this was untrue, that the Sun was printing silliness and lies, the people who read those initial articles still believed that there were blue unicorns and a golden temple on the moon. And that speaks to, again, the point we've made throughout this lecture, that pop culture does become really important to people and central to their identity. If you know anyone who believes in a conspiracy theory, and take your pick, right? There was a second shooter in Dealey Plaza, that Kennedy was killed by some conspiracy, or 9/11 was an inside job, or, vaccines cause autism, or whatever kooky conspiracy theory is out there. If you know someone who believes that, it's impossible to dissuade them. It doesn't matter how much evidence you marshal. It doesn't matter how much facts you might have on your side. And that's because that conspiracy theory is part of who that person is. It's part of their identity, and they can't give it up. Sometimes pop culture figures become so important to us that we don't want to believe something that might be disparaging about them. Right now, it's hard to talk about any pop culture figure from the 1980s because they've all been canceled. They've all been revealed to be quite troubling, to put it mildly. I mean, take your pick. Hulk Hogan, Michael Jackson, Roseanne Barr, Bill Cosby, right? There's something going on with pop culture figures of the 1980s, right? Well, when the revelations came out about Bill Cosby, there were many people who refused to believe it. And that's because they knew the Bill Cosby from the 1980s, from The Cosby Show, Cliff Huxtable, right? America's dad. In the 1980s, The Cosby Show was the most popular program on TV. It was celebrated as a new way of representing African Americans as educated, middle-class professionals. Cliff was a doctor. Claire was a lawyer, right? And so Bill Cosby had this very admirable place. He was America's dad. You wanted him to be your dad, right? And so later on, when all these revelations came out about him raping women, a lot of people refused to believe it because, again, they had been so invested in that pop culture icon of Cliff Huxtable. So there's, again, a lot of lessons here from the penny press. There's a lot of lessons here to help us understand the pop culture we still have today, that when people become invested in something, deeply committed to it, it's hard for them to be divested of it and separate themselves when revelations indicate that what they believe is untrue, or that people that they admired are less than admirable. So, a story from the Sun, one last chance for us to think about the penny press as one of the early examples of pop culture, taking the distant, making it close, making it meaningful, making it significant. The emphasis on the lurid, the sensational, the fantastic, the bizarre, as key to American pop culture in this period of a more passionate, emotional, public culture developing. Let's conclude, though, our look at pop culture with one last key figure from American pop culture in its early period, who has also had a huge impact that we can still see today in American society and culture, P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, the famous showman, manipulator, flim-flam artist. P.T. Barnum, like so many in this period, tapped into our interest in the strange, the aberrant, the bizarre, man-bats on the moon. He, in so many ways, was a man of his age. Now, P.T. Barnum was a remarkable figure who did some remarkable things that influenced and shaped American culture in ways we still see today. But there would have not been a P.T. Barnum without the broader currents below him, much like other figures we've encountered in this period. Charles Finney wouldn't have been so well known without the forces in American society that vaulted him to prominence, without roads, canals, and railroads that allowed him to crisscross the nation. Andrew Jackson wouldn't have been Andrew Jackson without universal white manhood suffrage and the upheavals it brought. P.T. Barnum was, again, like Jackson and Finney, a remarkable figure who contributed, for good or for ill, to American society. But P.T. Barnum wouldn't have been possible without the scientific changes of this period, technological period changes of this period that made Americans so interested in the new, the bizarre. And P.T. Barnum also traveled the country on the new network of railroads, canals, roads. His first moment of fame in America came in 1836, where he led an elaborate tour around the nation, availing those new forms of transportation with Joyce Heth, who was an African-American woman who P.T. Barnum bought. She was a slave. And he billed her as 161 years old. He billed her as the former nanny of George Washington. And so Joyce Heth would go out in front of a crowd and tell funny stories about raising little George Washington and changing his diaper and being there when he cut down the cherry tree, all those kind of myths that surrounded Washington. So Joyce Heth was an African-American woman who P.T. Barnum claimed was 161 years old, in a time where most people had a lifespan of about 40. And he claimed that she was the nanny of George Washington, that she raised little baby George Washington. Again, this is all bullshit and nonsense, but sold a lot of tickets, brought in the crowds. When Joyce Heth died, P.T. Barnum arranged for her autopsy to be performed in public as one last chance to get a few more bucks out of her body. As so often is the case in American pop culture, this early form of pop culture depended on manipulating, exploiting black bodies. In this case, the body of Joyce Heth, who again had been bought as a slave for P.T. Barnum's business efforts here. And then even when she was dead, he continued to exploit her body when he charged admission to her autopsy, where a doctor was going to perform this autopsy in an effort to prove that she was 161 years old. Now, when the autopsy was performed, the doctor, of course, said, no, she's not 161 years old. But P.T. Barnum, ever resourceful, said, oh, this isn't Joyce Heth. She escaped and is now living in Europe. And he claimed that the body the autopsy was performed on was somebody else. So he always had an out. He always had a way of getting out of his lies and deception. Remind you of anybody? Yeah, of course, right? These trends do indeed run deep in American society, the con artist. And P.T. Barnum was one who pioneered the con artist and the way of getting on with the con even when you're captured. In 1841, P.T. Barnum put down permanent roots for his brand of entertainment. After crisscrossing the nation for years with Joyce Heth and others, he opened the American Museum in New York. So it's again a story of cities. It's a story of urbanization as so key to pop culture, of having a base by which you can access that market of potential consumers, captive audience in a city. In New York City in 1841, P.T. Barnum opened the American Museum, which offered on display giants, people of extraordinary height. He had a display where he said, I found these authentic mermaids, women who are half human, half fish. And so he had these women swim in a tank of water with fishtails attached to their legs, in a tank that was really kind of murky. It was hard to see what was in there, right? So he can get away with, again, this fraud and deception. He had people who suffered from different maladies on display, right? Bearded children. One of his most popular exhibits at the American Museum was a room where inside the room he offered you a chance to view the fat boy. That's it. That's what was in there, a fat boy. Again, we Americans, we love generic, obvious names, right? When you plunk down your admission to see the fat boy, well, you know what you're going to get. This was a 5-year-old boy who weighed over 300 pounds. Nowadays, you could see that in any Walmart, but in the 1840s, that was rare. So Americans lined up to see the fat boy. So he had all kinds of displays of people who were seen as different, odd, unique. He was also a great showman, a great manipulator. because he offered exhibits at the American Museum that were so contemporaneous, so cut from the immediate headlines. This is, again, a romantic era where people are encouraged to engage with the immediate. It's an age of greater rapidity, a greater pace of life with railroads and canals and steamboats. And with it came many of P.T. Barnum's displays that seemed to be so immediate, so fresh, so current. We mentioned earlier our lectures on antebellum reform, the Shaker community, formed by Mother Ann Lee, and how people were fascinated by their fellow Americans who voluntarily elected to go and live in the rather unorthodox fashion of the Shaker community. They were really interested in this dance they did that was designed for them to shake out all their horny energy so they wouldn't be tempted to engage in sex. And so Americans knew about the Shakers. They were interested in the Shakers. Again, intrigue, anything different or strange. And so P.T. Barnum went out to Iowa, and he convinced a number of Shakers to live inside the American Museum. And then they would come out on the clock at certain times and perform their dance. So you read about the Shakers, and then you learn you could go right down to the American Museum and see them. You know, today, when anything happens, we instantly run to the internet and say, well, there's got to be video of it, right? There's got to be footage of it. It's got to be uploaded somewhere, right? We have the sense today in the 21st century that we should be able to see whatever we want, whenever we want it, that there's this immediacy. That anything that's happening can be instantaneously consumed in something uploaded to the internet. Well, in the 1840s, people could have a similar experience where they read about the Shakers and then could go see the Shakers well before internet culture. As we'll also talk about in a lecture coming soon, in 1846, the United States goes to war with Mexico. And the leader of Mexico was General Santa Anna. Santa Anna had lost a leg in a previous battle with the French. If you're familiar with Mexican history, if you're familiar with the history of the Cinco de Mayo celebration, you know that the French attempted to conquer and colonize parts of Mexico after it won its independence from Spain. And Mexico was able to defeat that in a number of key victories like that on the 5th of May. In some of the battles with the French, Santa Anna lost his leg, so he had a wooden leg. And now in 1846, America's at war with Santa Anna. He's the great enemy. He's the Saddam Hussein of the 1840s. And as a result, Americans were fascinated by Santa Anna. They were fascinated by their great enemy, their great antagonist. Well, P.T. Barnum said, I've got Santa Anna's leg. It fell off him in a battle, and now I've got it, right? And he would prop it up, and you'd pay a little bit of money to go and see the devil's leg, right? Because people saw Santa Anna as the devil, as the great enemy of America. Of course, this wasn't his real leg, but again, con artists are really good at getting away with lies and deception. And so P.T. Barnum made a mint off of these displays like the Shakers and Santa Anna's leg that seemed to be so immediate that really got people to plunk down their admission price because they seemed to be so fresh and immediate, cut from the newspaper headlines of the day. P.T. Barnum's greatest find, the individual he enjoyed the most profit off of, was General Tom Thumb, who was a little person, stood a little bit about 3 feet tall, named Charles Stratton. Charles Stratton was his birth name. And he was billed by P.T. Barnum as General Tom Thumb. So after he lost Joyce Heth, this became his next great traveling exhibit, Charles Stratton or Little Tom Thumb. Charles Stratton was a little person, about 3 feet tall, but he was a grown man. And so he would come out on stage and tell stories of his sex life. He would drink whiskey and smoke cigars. So the joke here, the entertainment value, if you can call it that, was here is a human being who's the size of a child, but he's telling you about how he got laid last night, right? So Charles Stratton was a great entertainer, great storyteller. He told stories that, again, crackled with sex and other intrigue, and he made a lot of money for P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum very much exemplifies this new age of mass culture, popular culture. He's tapping into people's interest in the strange, the bizarre, the pseudo-scientific in an age of scientific and technological change. And he, like the penny press, as the precursor to tabloid journalism, lives on in so many ways, as we Americans always fall for con artists of various sorts, infomercials offering you all sorts of products that look good on TV, but when you get them home, they don't quite work, or diet pills that promise you that in 6 weeks you'll have six-pack abs if you just take this magic pill, right? Other figures that maybe we can think of in other walks of life in America today who are good at cons and manipulations live on, and they're all the antecedents to P.T. Barnum, a key figure in early American pop culture of the early 19th century.